If you're not interested in the specific suburb today, seeing my thought process and the key things that we look at, that's going to really start to inform you as to not only things to look at when you're buying, but you can think about your existing properties and think, where do the suburbs stack up at the moment? Why is that also important, especially if you're trying to grow a portfolio, is if your property sits stagnant like a new build might do. The next question, is it still a good time to buy in WA?
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management, sales and buyers agency servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here's your host, Jared Mann.
G'day and welcome to a bit of a different episode this time. I'm going to mix it up on you. I'm going to go some of the questions getting asked on our Perth Property Investment Facebook group. I'll be tackling and providing my opinion. So I've chosen the top 3 or 4 over the last month that I thought could add value to all our listeners. And then I'm going to mix things up a bit and do a deep dive into an individual suburb. I'm going to call it something like Inside View, or still coming up with a name for it. I'll see if you guys like this format first, and keep in mind that whenever we look to analyze suburbs and choose where we buy on our buyer's agency side, we're looking at many factors, and we do a review using our trifecta criteria. So that's where we look at the suburb, the area, and the property to see if it's fully stacks up. This is going to give you a good insight into some of the key things that we look at for suburbs when we're going to decide whether to invest in them or not. Keep in mind the suburbs that I cover are not necessarily where we're actively buying, because I don't want to give all of our secrets away and show where we're and effectively add more buyers to compete with us where we're buying. But what I will do is open it up for suggested suburbs. So if you reach out and email me a suburb that you'd like me to review in an upcoming episode, I'm probably going to do it maybe once a month, once every second month, depending on how popular these Suburb Insight episodes are. And if you don't like the format at all, I'd love to hear as well. I only want to give you content that you enjoy and get value from. So I think even if you're not interested in the specific suburb today, by seeing my thought process and the key things that we look at, that's going to really start to inform you as to not only things to look at when you're buying, but you can think about your existing properties and think, where does the suburb stack up at the moment, thinking about the key things that Jared looks at. So hopefully that makes sense. Now let's start off by jumping into some questions. The first one is, there's a lot of advertising about paying off your mortgage in 7 or so years instead of 30 years without making extra payments. I think it's linked to purchasing an investment property with your self-managed super fund, which is what we want to do eventually. But I don't want to get sucked into sales pitch. So can anyone give me an idea of what strategy this involves, or point me freely to freely available info? This sort of advertising has been around a long time. You see the marketers that are representing a developer or builder, especially using it. It's really a bit of a gimmicky way to lure in a average sort of mum and dad person that doesn't know too much about investing in property, because they can be attracted to paying off their home sooner as the primary reason that they might invest, rather than actual creating of wealth, passive income, and securing their retirement. So what's luring people in is that paying off your home sooner. Now, I believe that what they're really promoting here is a debt recycling strategy. Now, I'd be happy if any of our listeners have looked at the inside of what some of these groups are doing and can share with me otherwise if I'm wrong. But I believe it's basically a debt recycling strategy. So what is that? It's where you buy investment properties using your home equity that you've already got. You then have all the rents and your extra savings going into paying off your home loan, and that pays it off sooner because you've got the rents going in there that otherwise wouldn't be going in there. And then you use equity to fund any shortfall on your investment properties for the first few years until they become positively geared. Now, in the case of how that might overlap with a self-managed super fund, that's going to make things a lot more complicated about whether rents can even be put in there. I don't know whether it can be done with a self-managed super fund, to be honest, because the fund needs to get its share of the rent and it's not really going to leave anything else outside of it. So I don't think it has anything to do with self-managed super fund, but happy to stand corrected. From my understanding, it's going to need to be outside of that environment and in your personal name, similar to what names your home is in. So this will have you saving money on tax along the way because you've got less personal debt in the home and more investment debt. And you're basically, why it's called debt recycling is that you're recycling your debt from being your personal debt, which you're paying off with the rents from your investment properties, and creating more investment debt in its place, using that equity to also fund the interest over the first few years until it becomes positively geared. And then you can start putting those extra, the extra cash flow towards paying off your home as well. And that accelerates things as you add more properties and rents keep going up and things eventually become even more positively geared. So the way that I look at this is that anything you do with your debt recycling or how you handle your tax benefits is really a byproduct and shouldn't be the main reason that you go to, create wealth. In my view, the creation of wealth is what truly changes your life. And that is going to be always most dependent on the quality of the asset that you actually invest in. So developers and builders are promoting this gimmick on the front end, and I'm calling it a gimmick because it's not the true reason why you should be investing. What you should be looking through to is what they're then going to put you into buying. So they use it to promote their products, their buildings, their off-the-plan purchases, their house and land packages. And very often, pretty much 99% of the time, these are in far out land estates where there's lots of land supply and the land's continuing to come on. So the trade-off of buying these new products, or they're in an oversupplied high density apartment where there's going to be similar supply issues. The trouble with this type of property is anyone that's been listening to the show for a while or been investing for a while will know is that the trade-off is that you're not going to get the growth that you're going to get in other more established areas. Yes, you'll have a higher depreciation and rental yield because their product is new and shiny and attracts a better tenant than you might get on a older property. But the trade-off is that you won't be getting as high a growth, and the growth isn't likely to start compounding at the same sort of rate that you're going to get on a more established property. So for me, it's the growth that really changes your life and should be the primary focus of what you're doing. You can still use debt recycling strategies and other, financing strategies with making sure that you buy a quality investment property underneath that's more likely to outperform in the short term, as well as stack up and hold its value in the medium and do well over the long term. So why is that also important, especially if you're trying to grow a portfolio, is if your property sits stagnant like a new build might do, in its first 2-3 years as the land's getting taken up, it could take 5 years, as we've seen to be the case in many of these areas, could take longer, could take 10 years, depends how much land's got to be released in the area and how that relates to the demand that is for the area from buyers. But what you're missing out on isn't just the growth on that one property potentially. If you had have gotten growth in a more established property in the first 2 to 3 years, you might have been able to use that equity to leapfrog into other properties and have been able to grow your portfolio. So think about it. If you can leapfrog your equity every 3 years into another property over 10 years, you might have 3 to 4 properties, all from adding no extra cash into funding your deposits. You can fund them purely from equity. Whereas if you're sitting and waiting 10 years for the suburb to finally have its supply taken up and finally produce some growth for you just so you can got enough equity to buy again, then you're going to end up with 2 properties in 10 years versus 4 properties or 3 properties in 10 years with a more established property that grows better. So think of the broader implications across your portfolio. Don't just focus down on the tax and the gimmicks. Boy, that was a longer answer. I didn't expect it to be so involved, but it is as you start to unwrap it. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, next question. Is it still a good time to buy in WA? Are there still good investment opportunities in WA? Sub 700 was from another person on the forum on our group. So, in essence, yes, it is still a good time to buy in WA, but you need to be a lot more selective. Previously, you could just throw a dart at the map across Perth, and in the last 4 years, you could have done really well. The whole of the Perth was very subdued, was depressed, has picked back to up in growth to more of its intrinsic values of where it should have been. And now we need to be very careful in our selection to be looking at what areas are still affordable, what areas are undervalued, where the data is driving our decisions, and looking at where, there's likely to be that growth in the shorter to medium term as well as the longer term. So really, asset selection and research is more important than ever. And there is opportunities at sub 700. But my caveat to that is that we'd be really looking, you're on the border at 700. We get some houses still at 650 to 700. But it really comes down to personal preference, because if you lean more towards wanting a quality location and overall asset, we're likely to be looking more at a villa now as a purchase. So you can still sort of get into Scarborough and Doubleview and these kind of areas for very well located villas that are sub 700 with still good upside growth potential. And we're definitely going to be having trade-offs if we're buying at the 650, 700 a house. So both of those can still be good investments. It's in the cross-section overlap. If your budget's only 650, I'd be leaning more towards, you're definitely looking at a villa instead of a house. But again, you need to be selective on where you're buying and what you're buying. Hopefully that makes sense. Hi, everyone. Oh, and before I move on, if your budget's more than that, I should mention, if you're in the 800 to 1.2 space, excellent time to be buying in WA. That market is still particularly undervalued compared to the bottom end, and it's likely to get the most amount of growth over the next 1 to 2 years. So a good time if you can stretch your budgets into that 800 to 1.2 sort of price point to be getting a more quality property. The yields are a little less than they originally were, but yields are less across the entire Perth market. Still more attractive than majority of other states. Even when you look at Melbourne and how subdued Melbourne's prices are, the yields there are still horrible. They're still bad. And you still have to cough up lots of money per month in most cases to hold the property, with yields being worse than the majority of Perth areas. So, Melbourne's no sure bet. A lot of people are moving to buying there, but they've got a long way to come back with their economy. And there's a lot of problems with, land tax and the Residential Tenancies Act pouring cold water on things. So Perth is still a very great option when you compare what else is available, not just in the shorter term, but the medium to long term. Hi, everyone. Looking for some advice. We're planning to replace the flooring in our current home to make it more appealing for renters. When we turn it into an investment property next year, would we be able to claim the flooring as a tax deduction if we install it while we're still living here? Or does it need to be done after we move out? Also, can we claim depreciation on the new flooring? Appreciate any insights. So, you do need to show that the property's been an investment property and producing income prior to having something count as a repair. Otherwise, it's going to be classed as a capital improvement. And under each of those scenarios, the depreciation is going to be different and have different rates. And really, this is the domain of an accountant. So if you really want to know, check with your accountant. I'm not licensed to give accounting and taxation advice. This is just my opinion of what I've seen. So please check with your accountant. But usually you have to have rented a property out for a while first. Having said that, I've been faced with this same decision a number of times where you need to look through to, I know you want the property to be presenting as good as possible to attract that quality tenant that you're renting out to. So that's a big consideration. If it's going to affect that quality of the person that's attracted, then it might be worth still doing it before, you rent it out for 6 or 12 months. But sometimes your standards as an owner occupier could be much higher than the standards expected of rental properties in the area. So you might be changing this flooring for no reason at all. It'd be definitely worth speaking to your property manager that you're going to use. We can obviously advise on that if you're looking to use us, because it's also worth considering what type of flooring is going to be most hard wearing, lowest maintenance, and easiest to replace in the future come 10, 15 years when you need to revisit replacing it again. So all those factors need to be considered. I wouldn't just purely look at the tax deductibility and whether it classifies as a repair versus capital improvement or not, and the depreciation that you can receive, because regardless of spending your money, you're still going to be able to depreciate it in some way. And the benefit upfront may be higher to you in having it done as you move out and to attract that new quality tenant rather than waiting and delaying that till later. But you may not need it at all. So why spend money if it's not needed and not going to produce a significant enough return to warrant it? So hopefully that makes sense, and I've given you a few angles to that one. Final question before we jump into our inside view on a suburb, and I'll tell you what that suburb is in a minute. But before we get to that, let's look at this last question. Can I claim the investment property renovation in the end of year tax claim? I'm planning to do a little reno before selling the investment property. Now, there's a few factors involved here, because with them selling, the short answer is check with your accountant on all this. But my view is that normally when you do, if you're adding things like I mentioned to repair an existing rental property that's been rented out, then you'd probably be able to depreciate it sooner than if it's being added as a capital improvement, and you'd have to depreciate it over a longer period of time. And that said, different things have different depreciation time periods, and that needs to be taken into account. So I know enough to ask the right questions, but not enough to advise you on tax. But if you're selling the property, even if the things that you do get classed as a capital improvement, they're going to be added to the capital base and come off of the capital gains tax that you would otherwise pay after you've sold the property and your accountant works out what your profit is. So one way or another, you're still going to end up paying less capital gains tax if you're selling, and whether or not that's directly claimable against the rental income for that year will be up to your accountant to work out, whether it comes off of the rental income and pay less tax on that, or whether it comes off of the capital gains tax profit that you pay and is added to the cost base. Let your accountant work that out. But either way, again, don't get lost in taxation things for making decisions. I can guarantee that if you do the right things to present the property, as in you invest in areas that are going to add the biggest bang for your buck, you're going to get more value back by far from that extra price than you are from the cost. In many cases, you can get $2 or $3 back for money that you spend on landscaping, money that you spend on painting, window treatments, and floor coverings being the top four. If you spend in those areas, it doesn't matter what you get back in tax later. Like, you do it just to get the extra in your sale price. And that goes similarly for investing in staging. If the property's not presenting well, that will be, in my opinion, added to the cost base, and it will get you far more back than the cost of doing it. So why wouldn't you do it? But you don't do it for the tax reason. You do it to make money. Focus on the making money, people, not the claiming of tax. Do that as an afterthought and let your accountant work out the best way to maximize your returns from tax, or minimize your tax rather. You maximize the returns, your accountant minimizes the tax after. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so for our new segment, I'm calling it Inside View, and today's suburb is Rockingham. So got a bit of a format in mind. There's lots of data. I'm going to try to speak through the key things that I'm looking at. Also give you a bit of a feel for the suburb and its fundamentals to begin with. We're then going to take a bit of a look at the supply-demand setup and what that means for growth over the short term. I'm going to look at the predicted growth from my data tools as well. And then we're going to take a quick look at the rental market how that's faring, because that's going to be ever more important to look at, especially if you're buying into areas and you want to make sure you can get a tenant and you're going to see increases in rental price. And then I'm going to look at sort of any major projects that are on the horizon that might also impact population growth and supply demand for the area. So we might get, I'm sure I will get better at these over time as we develop. But I first just wanted to start with something and see if you like it. So, Rockingham, does everyone know where that is? It's on our south coast. It's one of our satellite cities. The distance from the Perth CBD is 38 kilometres. It's where our Premier Mark McGowan used to live. I think he's sold up there and he's not our premier anymore. So I'm not sure what that means for Rockingham. But yeah, I know it was his where his electorate was and where he lived for a long time while he was there. And looking through some of the stats over the last 20 years, the population has gone from 11,400 odd people to 15,000. So it's been sort of increasing. It's increased a fair bit. There was a bit of land released in some parts there that have soaked up that population. It's fairly stable though over the last 12 years, going from 14,159 to 15,300. So stabilized population, which is a good sign at least that the area is fairly built up and there isn't more land coming on to, continue to increase that. We'd likely to have seen some of that increase from units and other things being added to the foreshore area down there. And that's probably the main source of population growth over the last, two census periods. So interestingly, the percentage of owner-occupier is 60%, so not too bad. Percentage of renter, obviously 40% on the flip side of that. And it's remained fairly steady over the last 3 or 4 census periods. So haven't had a big influx of investors, been fairly stable. I think, when an area has 70 or 80% plus owner occupiers, it's going to be a more stable market and people will be taking a bit more sort of pride in their overall, presentation and so forth. But 60% for me is still a reasonable level of owner occupiers, and people have their different cutoff points. It's something that we look at, but it's not the sort of key driver of where we'd, go be using to select areas. And other sort of notable things, when we look at the top 3 industries of employment, surprise, surprise, it's defence for down there. Then we've got the hospitals as the second top, and that's about half as many people as defence employees. And we've got other social assistance services also being a close third front runner to hospitals. So interesting, mix there, defence being the key one when we think about, we've got the Henderson boat yard building area, and we've got Garden Island off of there where the submarine bases are. Think about it. People like to have their families close by to where they work. They don't like to have a very long commute. So those things is what where people want to live nearby to where they're working. When we look at the current median house price, it's 668,000, with units being 425,000. We've had a 3-month change in the median house price of 2%, being $13,000, and 1.19% for units being $5,000. 12-month change has been 24%. So for houses, 24.86. So the market, you can see, is slowing down in its rate of growth. So if we had 2% for the last quarter, that's sort of on track to do 8% over the next year, and it's done 24.86% over the last year. So definitely slowing down there, but so is the majority of Perth areas in the lower price points, and this was at 668,000. So median price below that 700K figure. You'd probably be hard pressed to buy something for under 800 though in Rockingham, even though that median price is 668, and that's worth always noting that just because the median is at that doesn't mean you can always get in for something reasonable there. Now, interestingly, the 10 years average annual growth has been 4.67 for houses and 2.74 for units. So units haven't really rebounded back up again yet by as much as they have in other areas. Houses, arguably, with that sort of growth rate, that's only really tending towards its longer term average growth rate, which I'd expect to be around the 5% sort of mark. I can go and fish that out of the rest of my data, but I'm not going to reference it today in the show. So, arguably, it could still be undervalued from that 10-year average growth rate. I don't place too much importance on that anymore. I'm more looking to other key factors, which I'll cover off in a minute as to what's going to dictate the growth ahead, but it is worth noting. Now, the median rent is $580 per week, so 4.5%, which is still pretty reasonable, especially when you compare that around with other areas in Australia, 4.5% for houses. The median rent for units is 500, so 6.12% gross rental yield for units. I mean, you'd have to look at that rental yield and think that it's pretty attractive if you're chasing a yield. Units seem pretty undervalued at a 2.74% average growth rate over the last 10 years too. And I didn't mention earlier that they'd done 18% over the last year and they'd only done 1.19% in the last quarter. So on track for more of a 4.8% odd growth over the next year for units. So seem to be slowing down compared to what they've done. And when we now take a deeper look at some of the other key things that determine the shorter term growth potential, one of the first things I look at is days on market. And that is currently at 10 days on market. We look at the actual trend and it's been very low and consistently flat low for a long time. So still very tight market, which shows there's still pressure and properties are selling quickly. That's for houses. Units is at 14 days and a similar trend is in place. So a tight unit market. And I expect that there'll still be pressure on both houses and units as a result of this quick selling time for both. Now we can get a bit of an idea of the potential demand side of the equation. I can see that the potential buyer demand, and this is looking at aggregated visits per listed property versus the average number of properties listed. So basically looking at the online demand for the area, it's continued to trend upwards and still remains strong in a strong upward trend. So that looks very positive and is what is also keeping the days on market low, because the demand online from buyers has been continuing to increase, taking any of that supply off the market quickly. And when we check the other side of the supply equation, the supply demand equation, we just spoke about demand and how that's trending. When we look at supply, the sales listings has continued to trend down too. The market is still very tight for supply. So downward trending supply, upward trending buyer demand, low and holding low days on market for both units and houses. That's all looking very good for growth in the short term. Now, let's take a look at the predicted growth in this area over the next year, what sort of growth my data algorithm is predicting, and that's got its high growth predicted at 12%, which is very decent compared to a lot of other areas. So there's still definitely wind in the sails for Rockingham over the short term. So 12% predicted there. Now, what are some of the things that are going to go into affecting growth more in the medium term? We've spoken about the key factors over the short term. Let's start looking at some of the factors for the medium to longer term that might affect growth. Now, when we look at the ERSAD, which is the relative economic advantage or disadvantage for an area, we prefer to be in areas that have a 3 or greater as one of our key metrics for buyers to continue to be able to afford to pay increasing rental prices and buying prices, sale prices in the area. One of the areas that lets down Rockingham is that it's only a 2. Now, I take that with a grain of salt because that's the existing population that are living there. You can always have new entrants, either being investors or homeowners that have a higher than average economic advantage than the locals do. But it does give you a sense that the kind of demographic and people that are living there is going to have to change if for them to be able to afford higher prices, and that can often happen in an area, and this ERSAD can change over time. But at the moment, it is a two, so we typically like to see a stronger economic advantage for an area. One of the other key factors we look at is the affordability index, and this relates in quite closely with the ERSAD from what I've seen, in that it's the ability for people, the average income person that lives in the area, to afford the average loan, and it changes with loan interest rates and income levels when we get the next census data back. And it gives us a bit of an idea as to, can the locals afford loan interest and living there? And you can see that with prices having stretched so much, the affordability index is a 45.84 according to our data, and we prefer this to be under 40%. So these two factors may start to limit growth over the medium term if we're not getting a higher demographic and of people that are coming to buy into the area. Now, so we've looked at those two key factors. Some of the other things that we look at is the schools in the area and whether there's any other sort of major risks from an economic diversity point of view, whether there's any mining agricultural dominance, whether there's any flood risks or bushfire risks, and it checks out on all those different areas. When we look at the school ranking, having looked at many of our trifecta reports for this area over the years, I know that the high schools down there in the whole of the Rockingham area, not just Rockingham itself, talking Port Kennedy, Warnbro, there's a number of the high schools down there that just aren't that higher quality of school. Does it matter if the aspirations and more of the people end up in trades and wanting to work in the area and follow the defence force type work? Then it doesn't matter as much. But as far as tertiary entrance rankings and literacy, numeracy, etc., some of the primary schools are reasonable, but the high schools certainly lacking when it comes to competing with the top schools in the state. People aren't moving into Rockingham to seek out a high school. They're moving into other areas to do that. So that's probably one of the things that sort of lacks driving this stronger from a family's point of view. When we then finally look to, so some of those things are going to affect things over the medium term. I want to take a look at the rental side now. Let's speak about that. So the current vacancy rate from our data is showing as being 1.41. So still a relatively tight rental market. It has started slow, had a little bit of a trend up lately, hasn't turned into a full-blown trend up. It's still more on the sideways, more of a sideways trend at the moment, but to be watched, and it wouldn't surprise me if it does start to trend up a little bit more, because a lot of the Perth area is. And once we sort of get to 2%, we're in a bit more of a neutral market. When we move into 3%, then we're definitely neutral. So there should be some pressure on rental prices increasing when it's at 1.4%. So still a reasonable market to find tenants in quickly. A lot of the challenge we face down there with our property management team is we get lots of applicants, but I think also tying back to the ERSAD and affordability index that I mentioned earlier, we could get 10 applicants and only one of them's going to be quality that we'd be happy to go ahead with. And we're using very strict, I guess, criteria. We've got one of the most comprehensive criteria that I'm aware of when it comes to screening a tenant. So we are picky, not to say that they all wouldn't be good tenants, but we just know the probabilities and we try to limit the chances that we take. We do give people a break in many occasions if they still don't fit part of our criteria. And many of the people that we've given a break have ended up being amazing tenants. So it's just harder to find those quality tenants. And obviously, when we're getting bad references back, we're not going to take a chance on those. So rental market's still looking pretty reasonable. And then finally, what I wanted to touch on is projects for the area. You heard me mention earlier that the defence is the number one industry sort of driving this area, and it's very exciting. The major contracts that have been won for Henderson to have the submarine industry all based out of there in Garden Island. So this is going to add massive amount of jobs to the area. I think it's $6 billion odd dollars over a period of time. Huge amount of jobs. It's really going to support demand and growth in the area. And it's a wonderful thing for the overall WA to buy. And it's also never the one reason that we'd invest in an area, because we want as many of these other things to align at both the suburb, the area, and then I'm not speaking about our criteria for the property. We obviously want to make sure that that fully stacks up as well. But this has been a very encouraging big project that has given us more confidence in this far south coastal region. The other lifestyle aspects that attract people to the area are the beaches, the lifestyle. You've got Mandurah not too far away, and all the lifestyle elements of that. Still close to Perth. You're connected on the train line as well to get to Perth quicker, but most people that live down there make their lives down there. And with, Zoom rooms and remote working even more popular, I've had friends that have moved down there, got a lot better value for their money, sold up in Perth, simplified their life, made their lives down there, and they might have family or other parents down there. So unfortunately, I don't see them as much when they move that far away. It's not that far, but it can seem that way when you base your whole life up in Perth. So all in all, Rockingham, in summary, I think is going to do well in the shorter term. I definitely think that prediction for growth seems fairly accurate at 12% over the next year, especially now that we've had interest rates start to reduce, to add a bit more confidence back to the lower price points and show people that things aren't likely going to keep increasing as far as interest rates go. So pretty happy with that as a choice, but there's probably better choices for medium and longer term growth that have a more solid economic advantage / disadvantage and better affordability index for people to be able to afford higher rental and sale prices. So that's probably the one thing that's holding this area back that would give me pause for thought. And I do know that we have other suburbs that stack up better in those areas. But all in all, not a bad choice. If you've got a property there, I'd be holding it at least for a while longer, but preferably over the long term, because I think Rockingham is going to do well with that coastal appeal, do well with Henderson, Hull, and Garden Island defence industries now going to be a really major demand driver for that as well. So that's the end of this podcast. Hopefully that's been of value to see how I'm looking at suburbs, to at least get an insight into some of the key things that we look at in our trifecta reviews, and the data that makes helps us inform our decisions when we're choosing stuff for our buyers on the buyer's agency side. Of course, I can't run through everything, and I'm not going to give everything away in these sessions, but I think I'm open to hearing what you guys think, and if you want this to continue, let me know. And if you've got suburbs, reach out to Jared at investorsedge.com.au, INVESTORSEDGE.com.au. My details are in the show notes. You can find them everywhere online. If you've enjoyed this episode as well, give us a like or a review. I love reading your comments and feedback, and I really appreciate you tuning in. I'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
Just a reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature. As we don't know your specific situation, you should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group. To be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.